Thank you for joining us in our ongoing series of webinars. I'm Elliot Ruga, Policy and Communications Director for the New Jersey Highlands Coalition, and I am joined by my colleague, Zach Cole, who's the Outreach and Education Director here at the Highlands Coalition. Zach is our Technical Director for the webinar, and I am moderating tonight's webinar, which is Industrial Archaeology of the Highlands. The New Jersey Highlands Coalition produces this series of webinars on topics of interest in the Highlands and in the Highlands and beyond. We welcome Joe Macasek, President of the Canal Society of New Jersey, who will be giving his talk on industrial archaeology. But first, let me introduce the Vice President of the Canal Society, Tim Roth. Tim?
Okay, thank you very much, Elliot. Welcome all. Thank you for coming. Thank you very much to Elliot and Zach of the Highlands Coalition to set this up for us. This is what we're trying to do during these times. Typically, in the middle of summer, we would be very busy with programs, events. We would have our museums and other buildings open at Waterloo Village. We can't unfortunately do any of that, so we're trying to come up with alternate ways to enlighten people and entertain you during this time. I just want to briefly tell you about some of the things that the Canal Society is working on and how you can find out more about us. Currently, the walking trails are very popular. A lot of people are out doing COVID-19 walking. So we're currently working on walking brochures on the Moores Canal Greenway that we'll make available on our website. We're doing a lot of archiving these days, a lot of old photos and other documents. We're getting them online. We're also starting to work on a photo gallery for our website, which should be very interesting. And just in May, we published a special copy of our newsletter on the level. It was a story edition, and it has a lot of great articles, stories, old newspaper articles. And we're going to do another one in September. We also we have a program meeting coming up in September. We will probably not be able to do it the old-fashioned way where we all get together, so we'll probably do an online like this. So how do you find out about what we do? Well, first and foremost, there's our website, canalsocietyNJ.org. Has all about our organization, has about the history of the two New Jersey canals, the Moores Canal and the DNR Canal. If you want to get on our email list, you can do so through our website. And if you want to join us, you can also do that. If you're a Facebook person, we also have our Facebook page, Canal Society New Jersey. That's where we have all kinds of information, events, and so on related to the New Jersey canals, whether it's by us or by other organizations. So a lot of great stuff up there. So without further ado, I want to introduce to you my good friend and mentor and president of the Canal Society of New Jersey, Joe Macasek. Joe.
Good evening. This is going to be an industrial archaeology talk. And unlike dirt archaeologists, industrial archaeologists are more likely to go at it with a backhoe rather than toothbrushes and dental picks. And this is a discipline that you can do yourself. And so I've had lots of adventures, and I'll be sharing some of those with you tonight. But remember, when you're walking in the woods or just driving in your car, there's stories every place you go, and you can discover them. So go through a few interesting things. One of the most interesting topics of industrial archaeology in northern New Jersey is the iron industry. There's a great deal of very, very rich magnetite ore in the Highlands. And so this slide, you can see the Highlands in green. The orange color represents areas that are rich in deposits of iron ore, and the red shows the center of an area where many outcrops of ore come up to the surface and were mined from colonial times, up into the early 1900s. However, there are many offshoots, and we're going to look at a place near Mendham where there was both iron ore to be had, water power, trees for charcoal, and a Bloomery Forge that made a great archaeological discovery. This is the map of the central Highlands area. And every one of those dots represents an iron mine, and the stars represent an iron making location, a Bloomery Forge or a blast furnace. So there are many, many places to investigate. We're going to look at a story about Leddell's Forge. And this is a Bloomery Forge, and a very little known industrial process, but a situation that was very prevalent in the New Jersey Highlands. At a Bloomery Forge, you make wrought iron directly from the ore. Not a big blast furnace. This is a small operation where hearths are used to create a bloom directly from the iron ore, and then that bloom is hammered into a billet and then into a bar, and it makes a great finished product, a very gnarly, tough, malleable wrought iron that is very, very useful. And so this is a low capital intensive operation, and in an area like the Highlands that has rich magnetite ore, these Bloomery Forges were prevalent, and there were as many as 112 in the Highlands, southern New York State area. So lots of interesting places to investigate. This story starts with the gentleman up in the left-hand corner, Bill Wilkie, an old friend, since passed away, and he was on the school board with the ladies who lived. They had a home next to the very upper reaches of the Passaic River. Their house was on a ledge that used to support a dam of one of these Bloomery Forges. And they knew there was a forge site on their property, but they had never investigated it. But they had a mucky area down below their house that they always wanted to turn into a garden. Finally, they decided they were going to hire an excavator and a garden designer to make some improvements on their property. So as a result, Bill heard this story and contacted me and said, "You really need to go over there. They're finding some interesting things." And so I did, and there's Bill standing next to that huge wooden beam. And of course, the large picture shows an excavator and a lot of mud. And so they got busy excavating and pulling all kinds of interesting archaeological remains of this Bloomery Forge out of the mud that was down under the area where these people lived. You can see in the lower picture, there's lots of mud-covered, interesting objects. That's a piece of a water well shroud, actually. So this was a great adventure, and the homeowner was very obliging. Let us come and investigate and photograph and measure and try to puzzle out what all these pieces were. It was all a great mystery. The upper left-hand corner, Bierce Riley is using that huge stump as a desk to do some recording of the things we were investigating. When we arrived, many pieces had just been pulled out of the mud, higgledy-piggledy, so to speak, and just strewn all around, and so there was no assembly diagram. And so the site had been disturbed and left to lots of mysteries as exactly what was this all about. All those great big huge beams and pieces of wood that were incredibly well preserved. That square piece of wood with the wooden pegs in the lower right hand corner has been in the muck for about 200 years, and you can still see that the oxygen had never gotten at it, and it's in absolutely perfect condition. The picture in the lower left-hand corner is a mysterious peg that's going to come up a little bit later in our story. So as time went on, we got to move pieces around and figure out how they went together. And a picture showed up, the picture in the lower center, showing that the excavator had pulled out several pieces as an assembly. So we realized that the long beams were actually crossed by the short beams, and that those square pieces of wood actually were shims that were pushed up inside those mortises, and it was actually a huge wooden framework. So some investigation of other iron sites helped us a bit. We realized that that framework was actually the underpinnings of the hammer that would hammer the blooms into a bar. A huge 500-pound hammer was used to do that, and there would have been an anvil block into which an anvil would have been set in the center of the picture on the lower left. And that anvil would be replaceable. It would break every once in a while. And to the left below the anvil block is actually a hammerhead. Into that slot, a huge wooden handle would be placed, and the hammer would be picked up and dropped onto that handle repeatedly, hammering the bloom out until it was properly formed. And so we kind of knew what the above ground elements of the hammer arrangement were, but had no idea how the underpinnings might have been. Never had a chance to examine such a thing before. That pin, in discussion with the contractor, we discovered that that pin was actually pulled out of that huge wooden stump on the reverse side from the mortise. Up in the upper right-hand corner, you see that stump turned upside down with the mortise down and the flat side up. Well, that pin stuck out of the top of that stump, and it was a positioning pin. There are numerous iron-making artifacts strewn around the Highlands. It was a very important industry. And so up in Route 23, there is a bit of a picnic area, pull-off, and in that area is a little monument with a grist millstone in the center. And on the right-hand side is an anvil block from a Bloomery Forge without the anvil. So I knew it was there, seen it years ago, so curiosity drove me to visit it once again and to walk around the back, and there in the back was the positioning hole. So every once in a while, industrial archaeology takes an incredible amount of patience. You might observe something, observe dozens of things to which there are questions that have no answers. 5, 10 years later, an answer just pops up. And boy, is that fun when that happens. So now we knew that stump was the underground support for that huge block of cast iron, and those wooden beams were used to support the stump and to spread the shock out. So as the impact of the hammer would strike the anvil, it would spread that shock out and not just drive it into the ground. So there's a cross-section of a Bloomery Forge. The hearth over on the right where the ore was smelted and the bloom was created, and then in the center is the forge hammer operation, run from a water wheel that is on the right, and then underground would have been the framework, the pieces that we just saw put together that would have been supporting the whole assembly. So you can see the outline in the upper picture of the original building, now, excavated and filled with gravel and about to become a garden. In the lower picture, lower left, the last area to be investigated was the area along the back wall, and that was the wheel pit. And you can see that it was still full of water, and so they went into that pit and just to see what was there and pulled out about a third section of the water wheel that had been down in the mud, in the water for all those years. Any part of it that had stuck up into the air had rotted away years ago. But this came out all in one piece. An amazing find. And in beautiful condition. You can still see the tool marks. This is a masterpiece of wooden construction. Very few nails, all pegged together. You can see the surrounds, the curved pieces, and then the backboards, and parts of two of the spokes are sticking up, and then on the opposite side are the buckets that the water would strike to make the wheel turn. So an amazing find, an incredible, you couldn't imagine actually discovering such a thing. Other artifacts show up in isolated areas, all different kinds of places. Farney Highlands, Picatinny Arsenal, Black River County Park. I always like the picture on the right. This is a Swedish hammerman, and he's quite a handsome guy. He's very proud of his profession. He's got a very heavy leather apron that keeps him from getting burned with the sparks, and he's supporting with his gloves a huge pair of tongs that he would have used to hold the bloom on the anvil as it was struck by the hammer. And on his feet, he's got clogs to keep his feet from getting burned. And that the garment that he's wearing is a long linen sheath that also resists getting burned. Quite a handsome gentleman. These are some of the very, very few photographs of Bloomery Forges. Their remnants came into the period when people actually had portable cameras and could go out and take pictures of such gnarly things. And so these are two pictures of Bloomery hearths in which the iron ore was smelted into pure iron, turned from ore into metallic iron. And the drawing in the center is a cross-section that shows that pipes inside the upper parts of those hearths were used the exhaust gas of the fire on the hearth to heat the blast that was then blown in to accentuate the smelting process. And so that hearth was lined with huge, very, very heavy iron plates so that it could survive many heats of iron making. And you might think that such things would never survive into modern times, but there in the lower left-hand corner is one of the plates from the Durham Forge, discovered just in the woods. That hole in the center is the hole through which the tuyeres would have blown the air into the hearth. And so that picture on the left-hand side, if anybody can find that plate in that picture, industrial archaeology takes a very keen eye. You might have known that you were in the area of a Bloomery hearth if you found the hearth trash. The picture on the lower right is the industrial waste from the process that is the signature of a Bloomery industrial archaeology site, so you can tell that you're looking in the right area. But every once in a while you find a real gem, and in this case, that plate. And in the upper right-hand corner, you can see that it's 30 by 24 inches by about 5 inches thick, and it weighs several tons, and it's just too big to steal. So the only reason it has survived, no one has had the wherewithal to cart it off. I get calls from lots of interesting people, and Jason Huggins, the historian at Picatinny Arsenal, called me once, and he had found an artifact in the area of the Denmark Forge and wondered what he had. So the picture in the upper center is half hammered out bloom. Very often you find questions without answered. So for some reason, a huge bloom was half hammered out and never finished and left. So that's a piece of the finished product weighing many hundreds of pounds. And so for some reason, it was put under the hammer and half hammered from being a rough block of raw metal into a partially squared off billet and never finished. We have our hammermen again on the right, and then down below a cross-section of a typical forge hammer, water-powered by a undershot flutter wheel, and the hammer head is lifted by a cam and then left drop to hit the anvil. Not a very complicated piece of machinery, but very effective. In Black River Park, County Park, just south of Cooper Mill, I think it was Superstorm Sandy that had damaged the dam at the pond that used to be the water supply for the Hacklebarney Forge. The dam needed repair, and it needed some drastic shoring up, and contractors were hired to dig a trench across the old dam and lay in a concrete barrier that could not be broken if water surged over the dam again. And so in the process of cutting across that dam, all kinds of interesting archaeology turned up. Tons of charcoal, huge beams that were part of the forge building, and this roller. Now, I talked about the forge hammer and hammering out iron bars. Well, that's the old-fashioned way of doing it. Very, very labor-intensive. It wasn't until in the early 1800s that it was discovered that you could reduce an iron bar to a size where it could be rolled out rather than hammered out. And so, but there's no reference, no literature ever talked about that being done here in North Jersey. But every once in a while, you find something in the ground that goes, increases your knowledge way more than anything you find in the literature. When you've got the artifact in your hand, it's an undeniable piece of a story. And so every once in a while you get to complete that story, and sometimes you don't. So in the muck, this piece of a roller from a rolling mill that was used at the Hacklebarney Forge was discovered, and it's now on display in the visitor center at the Cooper Mill. Morris Canal is also a great industrial archaeology situation, 102 miles of very interesting archaeology. And so one of my favorite projects is the lock restoration at Lock 2 East in Wharton. This is a historic view of the lock on the right that would have raised boats about 8 feet from a long water-filled section of canal up to Canal Basin. Boats would travel a short distance and then go up an inclined plane heading west toward Lake Apacon. Lock tender's house is on the left. Now, there's a drawing that kind of shows the way the lock precinct would have been laid out. Miter gates at the lower end, stone chamber with gates on either side. Gates would be open, boat would float in, gates would be closed. The water would be let in from the upper level of the canal, raising about 8 feet, and it could go on its way. However, when the project started, a picture in the lower left-hand corner shows pretty much an open grassy field and some ruins over on the right-hand side, surrounded by a fence. And so John Mannock came to us at the Canal Society and said, well, we know that this is the site of Lock 2 East, but do you think there's anything there? Do you think maybe we could do something with that? And so we acquired a grant and did some exploration. I think we kind of imagined that possibly we might be able to unearth some pieces of the lock. Maybe even restore it, you think? Well, the first thing would be to discover whether there was anything down there to find. So archaeology was done, and a picture down on the lower right shows that a backhoe has been used to clear out part of the lock chamber. And so you can see that there are stone walls on either side. So, hey, we're doing pretty good. We know that there's actually a lock down there that possibly can be worked on. So one of the first things that was done, a cofferdam was built across the lower end of the buried lock to isolate it so that it could be drained as it was dug out. And there's a backhoe there packing down the sandbags that were going to keep water from flowing through the construction area. A lock is a huge stone assembly. Locks don't look like much when you stand next to them because most of it is buried in the ground below your feet. Huge stone walls on either side and approximately 100 feet long and about 11 feet wide, just wide enough and just long enough for a canal boat to enter. And the whole assembly is actually built on a wooden platform. About 60 10 by 10 wooden beams would have been laid along the length of the lock, and then a floor of heavy wooden planks on top of those beams to make a raft, so to speak. And on top of that, the stonework would have been built up. There are buttresses, and the walls are thicker at the bottom and get narrower and lighter as they go to the top. And so the arrangement is so that the walls of this lock will not move. You don't want these walls being undermined by the water surging through the lock. You don't want them to sag in or sag out. They're just big enough for the canal boat as it is. And so that wooden platform is to make it into the two separate walls on either side into a solid unit. And you might think a wooden platform would have been a rather, counterintuitive idea, but actually it's an ancient building technique. And as long as that wooden platform stays underground, underwater, it will be absolutely fine. As long as oxygen doesn't get at it, the wood will not deteriorate. So one of the first chores was to identify whether that wooden platform was still there, and so that the lock walls were still well foundationed, so to speak, and could possibly be rebuilt. So the lock chamber was dug out. And you can see some of the contractors down there in the mud, some lovely mud down there. The water from the upper level of the canal basin that's just in the trees beyond the picture on the left, had percolated through the lock for all those years, keeping whatever was in the bottom of the lock wet. And so all kinds of lovely archaeology came out of that hole. What we didn't expect was that when the lock was abandoned, its working parts were not carted off, were not taken to the junkyard. They were just thrown in the lock, thrown in the mud. And so all the working bits were there to be discovered. You can see gear wheels there and wooden beams. In the upper right-hand corner is the framework that held the gears and levers and winding drums that operated the drop gate at the upper end of the lock. And so it was a marvelous thing to go by day after day and watch all these things emerge from the mud. Some historic pictures in black and white. The upper right shows the lock tender's wife pushing the drop gate down, and just beyond her is the arrangement that was used to adjust the gate up. The two color pictures, upper left is the gear and drum that was used to wrap the chain that pulled the gate up. In the lower right is the bracket and spindle that was used to that the shaft of that gear turned on. So all those pieces were just in the mud and were rediscovered. Photograph of the drop gate itself, and this is not quite like the miter gates that you might have seen pictures of in modern canals. In this particular case, the drop gate opened like a trap door rather than like a double hung sash door, and so below the door were butterfly valves that allowed water from the upper level of the canal to fill the lock. And so those huge iron valves were still there. And you can see they've been knocked asunder when rocks were thrown on them from above, but they were still there. Those are very heavy. Those are solid iron. The lock gates were also still there. They had been, the lower miter gates had just been detached from their pivots and hinges and just let flop down into the mud. And so one of the gates came out in two pieces and one came out whole, not in the condition to be reused, but in marvelously interesting, one-piece situations, and they were carefully lifted out and put to the side. Picture of the contractors going about their work reassembling the lock, and they've put several layers of stone back on the walls, and they're working on pointing. And if you look straight into the lock, you can see that the wooden floor on which all that is built is still there and still in excellent condition. There's a beam across the bottom of the lock near where the contractors are standing, and that's the sill against which the lower miter gates close to make them watertight. At this point, it was getting to be late in the year. It was getting cold. Frost was happening in the evenings, and they were rushing to get this pointing done before it got too cold to do that cement work. At one point, they erected a plastic tent over the whole lock so they could heat it inside so they could complete their task before winter set in. In the spring, they had finished their stonework. They were resheathing one side of the lock. The lock was restored to resemble its latest incarnation, how it looked when we have pictures of how it looked when it was in operation. This lock had been rebuilt in the 1840s and enlarged to make it large enough for larger canal boats. And so the wall that was rebuilt was built of smaller, rougher stones, and it was sheathed with wood so that the boats could easily slide in and slide out. And so you can see one of the walls is covered with wooden planks, and a new floor is being laid over the old floor. Here's a view of the lock rewatered, and you can see the sandbag cofferdam. And so this is more or less the end of a phase one situation. In phase two, the lock walls were brought up to their historic height. The capstones were reapplied, and new miter gates were added at the lower end of the lock. And these are some gentlemen from Pennsylvania, Dutch country, who know how to build such massive things as lock gates. So you can see them reassembling those gates. Though those are operating gates. So in the future, if there's enough water in the upper basin, this will actually become an operating lock. This is the end of phase two. So phase three will be to rebuild the upper drop gate and rebuild the lock tender's house. And that is funded and and out for contract at this point. So that's going to happen in the next year and a half. It's one of my favorites. Olin F. Vo was a local photographer who really enjoyed taking pictures of the canal, and he initialed and dated all his pictures. So you can see in the lower right-hand corner, Olin F. Vo, OFV, and the picture is August 29, 1904, and this is the lock we've just been looking at, the lock at Wharton. Typical day on the canal, hot summer day, pretty much exactly this time of the year. And so a boat running west has just entered the lock, and everybody's going about their business. Lock tender in the upper left-hand corner is adjusting the drop gate. The captain has walked to the center of the boat, and he has opened the feed box, and he's preparing the feed baskets for the mules. They're going to have their lunch probably while they're on the next section of the canal. The mule tender is walking along the top of the lock with the mule collars in his hand. He's going to change those collars. The mules have been working up a sweat walking all morning, and so he's changing their collars. And the mules themselves are standing in the shade. They're the only ones who are having nothing to do except rest for a couple of minutes while everybody goes about their business. On the right, the two little girls are always they make a really great story. This picture is one of a series of pictures, and you can see that the girls have been following along the canal boat as it's been going toward the lock, and they've probably gotten off the boat in town in Wharton and been to the store. There's no refrigeration on a canal boat, and the living accommodations are pretty Spartan. So pretty much whatever you're going to eat that day, you need to buy that day. So they've bought provisions, and they've caught up with the boat at the lock, and so they're standing waiting, thermos in hand and baskets sitting on the ground. One little girl with a huge sunbonnet on, so they're waiting for the boat to come up on the lock, and they'll step on board. The drop gate will come down, and they'll be off again down the next section of canal. Two interesting things. If you look at the sliding door on the top of the companionway, you can see three little round objects. Those are tomatoes ripening. I think that those were in some farmer's garden this morning and were borrowed for lunch. A little further down next to the side of the companionway entrance, you can see a rather unusual object. That's a conch shell horn. To keep traffic moving, keep things on time, keep things going along, the canal boat captain was obliged to blow a horn as he was approaching the lock, so the lock tender would know he was coming, open the doors, let the boat in, and operate very efficiently. So that if you saw the end off a conch shell and have a good lip, you can make a really loud noise with that conch shell. So it's sitting there waiting to be used another time. The Wharton and Northern Railroad. There were many iron mine railroads. The Morris Canal was the first interstate transportation system across the Highlands that both delivered anthracite coal from Pennsylvania and going east, and shipped iron ore from the many iron mines in the Highlands west to furnaces in Pennsylvania. And so many tramways and iron mine railroads were built from the higher regions of the Highlands down to the canal. And so each of those red lines on the map represents an iron mine railroad. Mount Hope Mineral Railroad, Hibernia Mine Railroad, there was a Mount Hope Tramway, and the Wharton and Northern is the railroad in the center. Joseph Wharton came to Morris County toward the end of his career. He had made several fortunes and had been heavily involved in the Bethlehem Iron Company in Pennsylvania, but left that position and came to New Jersey and decided that he would open his own iron business. Not steel. People weren't making steel yet in huge industrial quantities. So he bought hundreds of acres of land. He shopped around Morris County looking for a place to establish his business. He went to Boonton and looked at the Boonton Iron Works and actually leased it for a couple of months and decided no, technology was too antiquated. He wanted a site with more potential and went to Port Orham and decided that the furnace there was exactly what he wanted. It had railroad connections, it had canal connections, and he bought the property and began to expand it. The town loved him so much they actually changed the name of the town to Wharton in his honor. At that period of time, he was the largest employer in Morris County. He owned iron mines and railroads, and his iron furnace in Wharton, huge operation. And he was the kind of guy that wanted to have things his way. He didn't like to have to pay other people to do things that he could own. And so he was very thrifty about those things. And he owned iron mines up in the Hibernia area, and he was always annoyed that he had to pay to have the ore shipped down. He had to pay somebody else to ship the ore down to his furnace in Wharton. So he cobbled together from several other railroads, the Wharton and Northern, and created a pathway to his furnace to deliver the ore to where he was going to use it. A picture of the furnace across the bottom, a sandboard map of the furnace layout, a very large operation. Diagram of the layout. The yellow railroad across the map in the center represents the Wharton and Northern coming from the north and heading into Lake Junction. Unfortunately, as his right-of-way approached Wharton, he ran into a situation where he had to deal with the tracks of the Central Railroad's High Bridge branch. And this left him again with a situation where he had to run over somebody else's tracks to get to his railroad. So in 1901, he built his own connection, the Morris County Connecting Railroad, extending southward from Wharton Junction, across where Route 80 passes now, and directly into his ironworks. He was just that kind of a guy. He was not the kind of guy to pay somebody else for something that he could make a profit at. The section that led from the Rockaway River into Wharton was actually supported by a huge wooden trestle, that picture that goes across the top of the page. I got to walk the route of the Wharton and Northern with Jason Huggins from Picatinny Arsenal. They still own a long section of the Wharton Northern because it is a potential rail access to the arsenal. And several years ago, they were debating as to whether they still needed to have that railroad right away. They thought maybe they could deaccession that. So as the historian, he was tasked with walking the track and seeing what was there. And so we discovered there was still rails on the track. The bridge in the picture in the upper center takes the route of the Wharton and Northern under the Jersey Central tracks. In the lower right, the one bridge along this part of the railroad has been burned by vandals, but is still in one place, and you can pretty much walk right across. So we had a great walk along the right-of-way and came to these wonderful ruins in the woods, these wonderful mysterious ruins. These are the kinds of things that you often come across and without a clue what it's all about. Why are they here? Not a clue to what their purpose might have been. However, fortunately, only just a few days after we took these pictures at Wharton Canal Day, we met folks from the Wharton Historical Society who just happened to have this picture as part of their display. So those ruins are actually the remains of the Wharton and Northern repair shop that had built right at Wharton Junction, just at that triangular connection between the old Wharton and Northern tracks and the new connecting railroad. The shops where the locomotives and cars were repaired. And so there's a view of the structures extant, still in operation, still being used. There's a drawing that shows the connection, the old tracks going one way, the connecting railroad heading south, and the spurs leading off to the repair shop. And so a diagram of the spurs, and these are all things that we actually found in the ground. The lower picture is the end of a boiler that's sticking out of the ground that was actually in the shop and used to power some of the machinery that was required. The rest of the right-of-way is no longer extant, and that trestle was completely filled in with earth and became an earthen berm rather than having to repair that rickety wooden trestle right of way. And later, the berm itself was actually removed and carried away as fill, except for the bridge abutments where the right of way crossed the Rockaway River. And both of those bridge abutments are still there, minus the earthen berm that had been used to carry the tracks above. And so the picture in the upper right, the backside of that berm is now used as a stage for Wharton Canal Day. So interesting artifacts often find new uses. Another canal story. This is a story that you couldn't make up. Sometimes I have no idea what's going to happen in a given day, and phone calls come in from the most unusual situations. Down in Highlands, New Jersey, down near Sandy Hook, a house was being razed because it had been damaged by Superstorm Sandy, and the owner was taking federal money to do the repairs, and so in order to qualify, the house had to be raised above the storm surge so that all wouldn't happen again. So when the house was raised, here's the piece of property. There's the town of Highlands. This is a very working class little shore community, very tiny lots, very small houses. And you see the long, thin house in the picture on the right. That's the project area. And you can see the shoreline is way out there. Well, years before, the shoreline was much closer in, and project area was right on the shoreline. And there was actually a slip in a boathouse, and the owner of the property had gotten himself a Morris Canal boat. The canal was abandoned in the 1920s. Dozens of canal boats were just left to rot, and he probably bought one for very little money up in the little basin of Jersey City and brought it down the Arthur Kill to this area and used it in his business until in the 1920s, another superstorm readjusted the shoreline and buried his boathouse and his little slip under tons of sand and marooned his canal boat and made it useless. So here's the building being raised above the storm surge. The contractors are lifting it up, and what they found underneath the house was the whole front end of a Morris Canal boat. The owner had just gotten creative. Rather than dig the boat out and haul it off, he just sawed it off at the timber line and used it as a foundation for the house. You can see the cribbing on either side. The house has been raised, and the boat is just sitting, just as it has been there for years and years. In good sandy soil, had kept fairly dry. Any place that had been pretty much under the house stayed in excellent condition. So we bargained with the property owner, and eventually she agreed to give the Canal Society this boat. So we negotiated with State Parks, and they agreed to allow us to use the White Barn at Waterloo Village to house it. And so the chore then was how to transport the boat. Only one neighbor, an older woman, was able to tell us the story as she remembered it of how the boat happened to be there. And so it really was not something well known in the area. So it was a great surprise to many people. The boat was in an amazing condition. You can still see in the lower picture, the oakum that's used is hammered down between the boards to make them watertight was still extant. On the upper right, the swash of tar that was laid over the oakum to seal the joint, still visible. The iron bolts that were hammered over to join the beams that supported the hull were still all in place. Amazing discovery in incredibly good condition. Unfortunately, there was no way to get that boat out from under the building all in one piece, so it had to be cut into two board sections and stacked up. This was a very tiny piece of property. There was no place for it to be. When we came to do the logistics of moving it, we actually had to work in the neighbor's driveway. There was no other space to be had. The picture in the center on the bottom is the picture of a canal, of a Lehigh canal boat that was discovered in Walnut Grove, Pennsylvania, in a quarry, and pulled out by some scuba divers and was left on the towpath for many years, and I photographed it years ago. It has since completely rotted and fallen apart, but you can see that the construction of that boat is exactly the same as the boat that we found here in the Highlands. Here's the homeowner on the left, and her house, having been raised and now all nicely fixed up with a stairway and walkway around the sides, and she was very happy with the results and very pleased to give us the boat. Transporting the remains of the boat from Highlands to Waterloo Village in Sussex County was quite an accomplishment. The logistics were organized by Bill McKelvey, one of our former board members, and his associate Phil Francis, who owned the truck and the huge forklift required to do the work. It was complicated by the fact that the boat was located in a very tight area of Highlands, and the truck that was going to be needed to transport the boat couldn't be brought anywhere near the location where the boat was found. And so we had to park the boat across town, and Phil brought his huge backhoe and picked up the boat piece by piece and carried it across town, and we lashed it down to the huge flatbed truck for transportation. That's the bow of the boat. That came off in one piece, and that's being loaded onto the front of the flatbed, and there's the whole assembly, bow and the front, and then all those pieces stacked up, and then the backhoe, forklift rather, on the truck. This was about 5:30 on a Friday afternoon, so it was a long slog through traffic up to Waterloo, and then the process in reverse. The truck couldn't get into the village, so all the pieces had to be carted piece by piece into the village and into the White Barn. Unfortunately, the bow, that huge wooden section, weighed many tons. And so we had measured and we had imagined that we might be able to rig a sling and angle it into the sliding door. But no, that wouldn't work. It absolutely would not work at all. It was too big and too heavy. The next day was Waterloo Canal Day, and with our full contingent of volunteers, we were able to do some careful surgery and section the bow into two pieces. And it still took 12 people, rollers and block and tackle, to move that into the building. It's now in the building, in display, with a selection of other artifacts, canal boat artifacts that we've had in our museum, with interpretive panels and lighting, and it is one of our finest accomplishments and one of the best exhibits at Waterloo Village. So we have the whole boat, but even the White Barn is not big enough to reassemble the whole boat. Maybe someday we'll have a big enough space, so please come and visit us and see our canal boat. In addition to having the boat, we've been adding to our display every year with some new additions, and so the rudder post in the picture is an original canal boat rudder post, and then our carpenter, the picture on the lower left, Earl Post, has spent 2 seasons recreating first a tiller and also that large rudder paddle. And we've now got the assembly mounted on the wall along with the picture. That large paddle was required because the canal boats only moved at about 3 miles an hour, very slow. So a vessel moving that slow needs a huge steering surface on that large rudder in order to get some bite in the water to get steer it. So that was our last addition to the exhibit, and so we've got some new things planned, and next season when we're open we'll have some new stuff. That's the end of the line. Industrial archaeology is something that any curious person can do. Anybody who walks in the woods know that they find interesting things that nature didn't put there. With a careful, trained eye, you can find all kinds of interesting things. It's sometimes been said that you can't find an acre of ground in the Highlands that doesn't have a story. And so you can learn to investigate those stories. It takes a lot of patience. It takes a lot of learning. Sometimes, though, you have many, many more questions than answers. But then again, that's part of the fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Since a lot of this focus was on the canal, can you tell us the status of the contemporary Mars Canal Greenway project?
Okay, the Mars Canal Greenway is a statewide project active in 6 counties across the northern part of New Jersey. To date, about 44 miles of the 102-mile route of the canal are in public venue, and there are many canal locations to visit. And every year we add more. Not all the sites are ready for prime time, but we hope to have maps and guides and brochures on our website shortly that will help people find and enjoy Mars Canal Greenway locations. And so if you are an experiential person who likes an adventure, come and visit the Mars Canal Greenway. To learn about Greenway locations that you might like to visit our website at canalsocietyNJ.org.
What was the kind of forge that was at Shippingport Road near Incline Plane 1 East? And are there artifacts of that forge that can still be seen there?
The forge at Shippingport is a very interesting archaeology site. The forge ran off the bypass water from the Mars Canal Incline Plane, and the water power arrangement is still extant. You could follow the raceway from the powerhouse ruins of the Incline Plane through the woods into a large pond that brought the water to the forge site. And so the site itself is very, very overgrown. So it does take a trained eye to discover the bases for the 2 forge fires, wheel pits for the 2 water wheels that operated the bellows and the hammer. It probably has more extant artifacts than many other sites. It hasn't been greatly disturbed. Although it is on private property, there's a public easement that allows the public to visit that site. One thing that you should always remember, however, when visiting an archaeology site is to look, learn, ask questions, but leave the artifacts where you find them. If you found something interesting, you must realize that if you carry it away, you're taking responsibility for that artifact. And so you break the chain of custody, as they say in the cop shows. And so you take that artifact away and you stick it in your garage, and it's lost and unlabeled, and it's just another rusty, dirty old rock or piece of metal that eventually gets discarded if not properly cared for. So if you're going to take an artifact from an archaeology site, remember that you must do something creative with it, or just leave it there for somebody else to find in years to come. If people visited archaeology sites and took away all the artifacts, there would be nothing left to find.
Okay. Are there photos of the train stations that were along the Wharton and Northern Railroad available anywhere?
The Wharton and Northern Railroad was a very rural undertaking, and it did not have very commodious stations. The most knowledge of the Wharton and Northern that you can find in one place is in a book called Iron Mine Railroads by Larry Lowenthal. It's been republished by the Tri-State Railroad Historical Society, and it is a gem. It deals with most all of the iron mine railroads, and it is the book to go to if you are interested in this topic. It's a wealth of information, and if you're interested in industrial archaeology in the Highlands, you need a copy, and you need to read it and read it several times and go out in the woods and explore.
Is there a way for the public to access the maps that show the locations of the mines and blast furnaces in the state? I know that on the Highlands Council website and on the DEP website, each of them have an interactive map that includes a layer showing abandoned mines in the state. And I know in the Highlands, there were between the 18th century and middle of the 20th century, 512 known mine locations that are shown.
Probably the best place to look for the location and information about iron mines in New Jersey would be the state geologist's website. Lots of good material. There's a selection of maps that you can download from a list of mines, and you can also download a copy of the 1910 State Geologist Report, which is a compendium of many years of reports on iron mining in New Jersey. So that's a great place to start. For iron making locations, Jim Branson's book about iron making in the Ramapos has been reprinted, and that's a marvelous book, beautifully researched. It doesn't deal with all of the Highlands, just the New York, New Jersey border area, but a great read and many, many good adventures to be had. And then Larry Lowenthal's book about iron mine railroads is then a good source. Other than that, there's not a lot in one place. If you really are interested, you're going to have to discover. Start with those two books, and you will be led into evil ways.
Do you find much in the way of personal effects of the folks who worked in those facilities? Things like artifacts of that reveal what their life was like, bottles and whatever people discard in their lifetime.
Sites where you find artifacts related to individual people are rare. Bottles, hobnail shoes, cooking utensils are the few kinds of things that survive, and they are rare and usually better left where you find them. If you cart them off, then you break that chain of evidence, and they're not there for somebody else to find. The mining town of Orland in Upper Hibernia was a densely populated mining community. There were 2,000 people lived up there, 1,500 to 2,000 people in the late 1800s, and the remains of that village are all there. The foundations of all those houses, all terribly overgrown, and you find bottles, trash, and all sorts of remains. But again, I'm an amateur industrial archaeologist, and I don't dig. And so digging is a destructive process, and so once you dig something up, you can't dig it back in the ground again. And so once you've disturbed the site, it is pretty much impossible to put it back together again. So I'm always very, very careful about disturbing an area, and will often puzzle over such a discovery for years and record what I find. And such a place as Upper Hibernia is a great place to visit. And it's state park property. Go there, wander, go on one of my tours. I do tours for Morris County Park Commission. One year we'll do Lower Hibernia and visit the lower town. Another year we'll do Upper Hibernia and walk all through that marvelous area and look at the foundations, look at the mine holes, look at the pits, look at the remains of the shafts. And I'd love to take people through that.
How are these projects that you restore funded, Joe?
Funding for history projects is available from the Morris County Historic Preservation Fund and from the New Jersey State Historic Preservation Fund. And both of those sources are difficult to get and arduous to get. There's great competition for those funds, and archaeology is very expensive. Probably even more than that, you need to have a vision of what you expect to do and a reason to do it. The Canal Society has been very involved with projects like that and supported projects like that in places like Wharton and towns like Boonton. But you need to have a clear vision about what you expect to do. And so lots of organizations apply for money to restore historic homes, to acquire open space and historic properties. But in every case, these grants are difficult to get and need to be properly managed. And so anybody who has any issues with public money being used for history things should realize it is very, very arduous to spend public money on these kinds of projects. And it all needs to be accounted for and excruciatingly complicated to be done properly.
Last question. Is the Wharton and Northern right-of-way legally walkable, or is what's left of it all on Arsenal property? It would be interesting to explore the remnants of the engine house.
Areas of the Wharton and Northern Railroad can be accessed. The southern end from Berkshire Valley Road can be walked on public property all the way up across the Rockaway River to the junction with the connecting railway and the ruins of the Northern Repair Shop. That's all on public property. Beyond that, there's a privately owned housing development and the Arsenal. Above that, there are sections of the Wharton and Northern that are on public property that are walkable, with some very interesting stretches that lead up into the Passaic watershed area, where you need a permit to walk. But if you want to explore those areas, the best thing to do is to get a New York to Jersey Trail Conference hiking map, the Jersey Highlands series, and all you need to know is really on those maps. And there's many miles to walk and many interesting places to explore.
Great. Well, thank you, Joe and Tim. It amazes me how many enterprises that were the livelihoods of entire communities, employing thousands of people, including highly skilled professionals and tradespeople, which have entirely disappeared from the landscape, except for some curious remnants poking out from under the weeds and the vines, whose mysteries are unearthed, investigated, and finally fleshed out, interpreted by people such as you. Joe, you guys at the Canal Society do a great job. The New Jersey Highlands Coalition hosts this presentation. We advocate for the protection of the water and other natural and cultural resources of the New Jersey Highlands. We'd love you to become a member. Help support this series of educational and entertaining webinars. Find out how to join us at njhighlandscoalition.org and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And our hashtag is @NJHighlanders. We have this and all of our webinars archived on our soon-to-be-launched YouTube channel. Meanwhile, they can be seen on demand in their entirety now on the video tab of our Facebook. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Until next time, good night.